Here we are looking at Theodore Dalrymple's arguments against the legalization of drugs. Before he begins with the specific arguments about legalization and drugs, he makes a meta-observation, and he describes a common progression that occurs in society regarding our general beliefs about something. So at one point, something is unthinkable, but then it starts to become thinkable. In other words, something is maybe universally condemned, but then a few people start questioning, maybe we ought not condemn this activity. That questioning becomes more common and then gradually becomes much more accepted. Finally, not only is it broadly accepted, it's considered an orthodox truth. I believe Dalrymple will agree that this is what has occurred with, say, views on homosexual relationships. Certainly 50 years ago or so, it was kind of unthinkable that that would be acceptable, and then gradually becoming more and more common, and so on, going through this progression until it's currently, of course, our society believes there is nothing wrong with such relationships. And he claims that this is the case with legalizing drugs. Now, for Dalrymple, though, of course, he thinks that this is a mistake. We're not making any judgments or claims about what he might think about the changes in views on homosexuality. But when it comes with drugs, he says that this is a mistake. And a general concern that he has is that contemporary society has much greater access to a wide variety of mind-altering drugs than in the past. And so this makes the issue of drugs of greater concern. In addition, we now have a citizenry that strives to seek pleasures in their own ways. In other words, we have valued liberty and individuality and the seeking of pleasure to the point that drugs have become a much more commonly accepted way of doing that. Dalrymple considers three arguments for legalization, and he puts those into two different categories, two approaches, what he calls the philosophical approach and the pragmatic approach. I think the lines between the two are not that clear cut, but let's follow his designations here. The pragmatic arguments are clearly utilitarian in nature, that is, taking a cost-benefit analysis of legalizing drugs and then determining which view would be of greater value. The philosophical arguments are based on a no-harm principle similar to John Stuart Mill. So we're not talking about his utilitarian views per se here, although that will be relevant. We're talking about his views in terms of government restrictions. And he says the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So this is a principle of Mill, the idea being that we should let people live their lives however they want to, unless what they're going to be doing might harm others. And then we have, as a government, right to restrict their behavior. And Mill continues, his own good, either physical or immoral, is not sufficient to warrant restriction. So in other words, even if the government recognizes that something is really bad for a person, they should not restrict it unless it causes harm to someone else. And this does seem to be one of the libertarian principles, the first argument that we considered with Coussin and Bloch, the one that was unlike the 10 utilitarian arguments. So the regular use of or the addiction to drugs does not merely affect the user, argues Dalrymple, but also his spouse, his children, his neighbors, and his employers. We could add employees if the person is in a position of owning a business. So that would be problematic off the bat. Dalrymple argues that this is not something that merely affects the individual who is taking the drugs, but it can cause harm to others. He also argues that Mill's principle is nearly useless in determining what should or should not be permitted in practice because of these kinds of things, where it's hard to determine how much one person's harm to themselves might affect other people. And so because of this, even if one is harming oneself, there are other people affected by it. And so using the harm principle as a way of determining what should or should not be restricted, Dalrymple argues, is nearly useless, virtually useless. He also makes this point that once a prohibition has been removed, it is extremely hard to restore. And even if that proves to be socially disastrous, and Dalrymple is quick to point out that even Mill put limits on his own harm principle. For one, thinking back to what we learned from utilitarianism, some pleasures are of greater quality than others. Some goals are intrinsically of more value than others. In other words, not all pleasures are on a par with one another. And the person who is most free is not one who slavishly follows his appetites. So even Mill could agree with this, that there are higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And if one is merely following the lower pleasures and becomes consumed with those to the point of being incapable of pursuing the higher pleasures, then that is problematic. And Dalrymple, like many philosophers, is prone to extreme examples to make his point, but it does make his point. So he has this extreme case that shows the limits on Mill's principles. Consider the prohibition of public exhibitions of necrophilia. Certainly we have these. I think it's a generally considered good idea that we have these, but it could be argued with the same rationale that is used for legalizing drugs. Look, no one's harmed. It brings pleasure to those involved, so there's no basis for its prohibition. Now, again, presumably, it ought to be obvious that necrophilia ought to be prohibited, ought not to be something that is publicly exhibited. It seems to be a clear case, and yet if all we're concerned about is whether or not people are pursuing their own pleasure and whether anybody else is harmed, it seemed like that might give a justification for it. So this is a case where he's trying to show the limitation of the harm principle. Dalrymple goes to the concern about drugs and liberty. So this was one of the first arguments of Cousin and Bloch. But he says, Dalrymple argues, wait a minute, the consumption of drugs actually reduces one's freedom. It's not an action of freedom, it's a reduction of freedom by limiting what the individual can pursue. It limits opportunities for raising a family, for fulfilling civic obligations, for example. Someone who is continually consuming drugs is not capable of pursuing other things. And he makes this judgment that taking drugs is a lazy person's way of pursuing happiness. Now, I would say on both of these, of course, he's kind of assuming that the drug taking is an overwhelming or dominating force in one person's life. So he's not really considering certain individual cases where that does not, in fact, take place. Now, restrictions against drugs do not create a significant loss of happiness or value in one's life. Recall we discussed this on the issue of Cousin and Bloch and whether this makes you a slave to the state by having restrictions against the use of drugs. And Dalrymple argues, of course, it does not. This is not that big of a loss. Now, pragmatic arguments for legalization. What arguments are there? Dalrymple considers opposing view, and some of these are very similar to ones that Kusin and Block presented. The harms done are due to legal restrictions, not due to the effects of the taking of drugs. So, for example, crimes occur because it's illegal to take drugs. Costs of enforcement is great, and we could save money by not having drugs be illegal. Potency of drugs is high and not controlled when drugs are illegal. So these are all harms that result from having restrictions on drugs. A second argument that Dalrymple considers is that if legalized, drugs would be less expensive and thus would reduce the needs for burglary or theft to support their use. Now keep in mind here, these are arguments that Dalrymple is considering from his opponent's perspective, right? These are not arguments that Dalrymple endorses. They're ones that he is evaluating and considering. And so he's considering this argument. Look, if legalized, there wouldn't be as much theft, there wouldn't be as much problem with burglary or other crime because the cost of the drugs would be reduced. And compared to alcohol, prohibiting the use of drugs is hypocritical, arbitrary, and dictatorial. In other words, we allow the sale and consumption of alcohol, but it's the cause of a great many problems in society, and yet there are other drugs that are less harmful than consuming alcohol. And so because of that, we're not being consistent as a society. That's the argument there. So Dalrymple kind of sprinkles his responses to the three arguments throughout the article that he has. So I've tried to organize them somewhat in terms of responses to these arguments. And we saw that one of the arguments for legalizing drugs was that their harms are due to their illegality. So of course the illegality of drugs is the cause of their criminality. So Dalrymple grants that, but then he says, but that's the case with parking violations, stealing cars, rape, and murder for that matter. In other words, we make things illegal and that produces crime because people don't follow the laws, even with parking violations. So having restrictions against them makes it illegal and thus increases crime. We could reduce crime completely by not having any criminal laws. And obviously Dalrymple says that would be a crazy thing to do. A second point that he makes is that proponents of legalization often claim that it's not possible to win the war on drugs and we are losing this war, so why should we be fighting it? His response is that the impossibility of winning the war on drugs does not provide a good argument. Why? Well, we're not winning the war on theft, burglary, or fraud either. In other words, those things continue to occur despite laws against them. But he says that does not mean that we should make them legal. The motive behind many crimes as well is to get rich quickly and easily. And he says that motive won't disappear when we legalize drugs. In other words, people will continue to seek easy money, quick money, through theft, burglary, through fraud, through whatever other crimes might occur. And Dalrymple is a Brit, and he talks about methadone clinics where there is a very common situation where former heroin addicts are prescribed methadone so that they can get off the heroin, and methadone has fewer negative side effects. But Dalrymple says that studies in Britain have shown that those who use methadone still commit crimes at a very high rate, and even though it's legal. So that the use of the drug itself might be a cause of crime or otherwise related to crime. And so legalizing drugs will not reduce crime. Dalrymple goes on to argue that using drugs produces an increased risk of significant harm. So some drugs, such as stimulants like cocaine, result in increased aggression, especially in the home. So that's problematic for other people. And decriminalization might easily result in an increase of use by children. So there are two concerns he is raising here. Harms done to others might increase with drugs being legal, and that would be the case with drugs like cocaine or PCP, et cetera. And if drugs are decriminalized, there would be more likely to have drugs in the home, and it would provide more easy access for children to use, which I think everyone agrees would be problematic. Recall there was another argument for legalizing drugs, that there is an elasticity of use such that if drugs were legal, the use would not increase. And so there's somewhat of a natural limit to the use of drugs, and the demands wouldn't increase if legalized. The idea there is narcotics were seen as a necessity, and so they're going to be used whether or not the laws are against them. And a lot of people recognize the harm of drugs, so that they would not use them just because they were legal. But Dalrymple cites with great detail an actual example of a construction project in Africa. And here, for some reason, the company overseeing the project provided alcohol very low cost to the workers. And as a result, about 20% of the workers would be so drunk when they go to bed that they were incontinent. And nearly half of them were drinking so heavily that their hands would shake at work when they weren't drinking. So to avoid that, they started drinking on the job, even though they were operating heavy machinery. In other words, consumption of alcohol increased dramatically because it was so readily available at a low cost, and the increase resulted. So if, in fact, legalizing drugs lowers the cost, the argument being then it would lower crime. Well, if that does occur, Dalrymple argues that the use would increase. Drugs and crime, again, legalizers argue that the amount of crime would not increase with legal access to drugs. In fact, right off the bat, you would reduce some crimes, that is, the crimes of taking drugs. Now, it may have some truth for individual cases, agrees Dalrymple, but that's not the same as reducing the amount of crime for addicts when taken as a whole. So, Dalrymple provides an analogy with prison. And some people claim that we need prison reform to a high degree. In fact, there's such a high rate of recidivism among prisoners that prisons don't work at all, so we should just get rid of them. There are arguments along those lines. But would we really think that abolishing prisons would decrease the reasons that people are put in prisons? Murder, drunk driving, those kinds of things. And Dalrymple says, of course it would not decrease the activities that results in people being in prison. Instead, those would increase. And so, again, it's an analogy with legalizing drugs. That is, eliminating prisons would be like legalizing drugs. You eliminate prisons, you don't decrease crime because of that. You legalize drugs, you don't decrease the amount of drug taking because of that. Finally, it's often said of those who argue for legalization of drugs that many of the drugs that are illegal are no worse than alcohol. And Dalrymple argues that there there are some similarities between drugs and alcohol, and he makes one in his analogy in the case with Africa and the consequences of having inexpensive access to the intoxicants, as well as there are analogies with children having greater access to drugs if they were made legal, just like children have greater access to alcohol because alcohol is common and legal. However, Dalrymple argues that the prohibition of alcohol failed, but that doesn't provide a good comparison at all. It's one thing to prohibit a drug that is in customary use. That was the case with alcohol prior to prohibition and is the case with alcohol now. But it's quite another thing to retain a ban so that they do not become customary in use. So he's arguing that there's a significant distinction between alcohol and drugs. Alcohol is commonly used already, so to restrict it doesn't work. It is so entrenched in society and has been for centuries, whereas drug use is not entrenched in society, so having laws against it can continue to prevent it from becoming common and entrenched in society. So there's a disanalogy with drugs and alcohol on that basis.